start with some slides and I'll welcome everybody and then I'll hand it off to you. So, hi everybody. Let me go ahead and I'll pull up some slides. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. We have a lot of folks joining us this afternoon, something like 200 folks signed up. I am going to start by introducing the Laguna Foundation and talking a little bit about our work before jumping into a conversation with Jenny Odell, who is here with us today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right. Can everybody see that? Hopefully you can see this beautiful photo here on the screen. If you are just joining us, it would be great if you could say hello in the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from today. We are, in this funny Zoom format, and this is really the only way that we can engage with you in a webinar form is by the chat. So feel free to say hi. I'd love to hear where you're coming from. And perhaps as you are dropping your name and where you're tuning in from today, you could also, if you know, identify this bird that is flying in this photo, and bonus points perhaps if you can tell us how you made that identification. That would be great and fun. Looks like we've got a lot of folks here today from all over. Lots of folks from Sonoma County. It's wonderful. Also some folks from Seattle and Arizona. So all over the US, British Columbia. Hello, welcome. Thanks for being here with us today. All right, I see some answers to this bird question popping up in the chat as well. So thank you all. We'll get to that in a minute. Hello, I'm going to get started with introducing the Laguna and our work. My name is Allison Titus, and I am the Community Education Manager here at the Laguna Foundation. This event kicks off our Birding to Beat the Winter Blues series, which is supported by the County of Sonoma's Board of Supervisors Community Investment Program. So thank you to them for supporting us and supporting this series. I want to let you know to start out that there are 3 more events coming up in this series. This Friday, you can join us for Breaking into Birdwatching with Miles and Teresa Tuffley. They are 2 local instructors and they are wonderful instructors. And this is a great presentation, both for beginners and for folks looking to refresh their skills. Next, on February 4th, Irma Cuevas and from Sonoma County Regional Parks and myself will be giving a presentation all about bird migration, and that will be a bilingual event. Bird migration is an incredible and awe-inspiring feat of nature and one that still has lots of mysteries and secrets to discover. So if you've ever wondered how or why or where birds migrate, we will tell you about what we do know in both Spanish and English. So if you speak either language, you are more than welcome to join us for that event on February 4th. Finally, we will conclude the series with learning about waterfowl, which is kind of a nice follow-up to the migration webinar. We will learn about waterfowl of the Pacific Flyway with local naturalist Dave Barry on February 11th. So I hope you join us for another one of these events in the series. And all of these events, including this one, will be recorded and sent to registrants. Oh, I see some IDs coming in of the birds in these photos too, which is great. So thank you all for your answers in the chat about this particular photo. Some of you were absolutely correct. The yellow feet that you can see here on this bird indicate that these are snowy egrets. So Well done. And that is a fun bird that we see a lot here in the Laguna. So thank you all for attending this program, and thank you for supporting our work at the Laguna Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa, California, that works to restore, conserve, and inspire public appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa wetlands. There are a lot of ways to describe the Laguna and our work. The Laguna is a wetland and a 22-mile-long waterway, as well as an entire watershed. And if you live in Windsor, Santa Rosa, Cotati, Roanoke Park, parts of Sebastopol, you live within the Laguna watershed. The Laguna de Santa Rosa faces important issues that drive our restoration, conservation, and education work today. In summary, in more modern history, it has gone from being described as devoid of life in the 1970s to being designated as a wetland of international importance in 2011 because of the incredible biodiversity found here. So here are some photos specifically of the bird diversity we have here in the Laguna. Since this is a Q&A, I thought I'd throw in some bird photos for you all at the beginning. Anyway, we received the Wetland of International Importance designation 10 years ago as of this year. Even with that designation, there is still a lot of work to be done. The Laguna today, while it is not devoid of life by any means, still has poor water quality, high amounts of introduced species that threaten the very biodiversity that makes it special, impacts from wildfires on the outskirts of the watershed, and many people do not know why the Laguna is so important, or even where it is, even though it sustains over 250,000 people, in addition to the plants and animals, all these birds you see here. And to answer the question in the chat, this is a downy woodpecker here on the left. We've got a barn swallow here down below, a wood duck on the right, I believe a red-tailed hawk here, and a black-crowned night heron right here in the center. All of these photos were taken in and around the Laguna watershed. We are the only organization that is dedicated specifically to conserving this watershed and working to restore wetland habitat, manage introduced species that threaten this biodiversity, and improve the water quality through tracking sediment and restoring creek banks, as well as educating and inspiring future generations so that the Laguna is a place for everyone to enjoy for years to come. Okay, so even though many of you have probably spent more time than you ever imagined you would on Zoom in the past year, I still have some housekeeping notes for a successful webinar experience with us here today. So please add your questions and say hello in the chat box. You can find that by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen, and the option to select the chat box should pop up. You can click on that icon and then say hi if you haven't already, and let us know where you're tuning in from today. Another Zoom note, when there's this little box that says type your message here. Above that, there's a little message bar that says to, and you can select if you want to chat with all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if you want everyone to see your comment or your question, you want to select all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, I will see it and Jenny will see it, and that's it. So I will be starting off our Q&A with some questions of my own for Jenny, and then we will have some time at the end for some questions from the audience. So I think that is it for my housekeeping notes at this time. I want to give a warm welcome to Jenny Odell. Thank you so much for being here with us today. As both a nature-loving person and someone who personally struggles with over engagement on social media and doom scrolling, as they say now, aspects of the attention economy, I found Jenny's book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, to be an incredibly useful resource that gave me philosophies and ideas upon which to choose how to engage with the digital world and beyond. I think it is useful because Jenny acknowledges just how complicated that choice really is in our modern times. And this is not a book that just simply advises a digital detox. I think the Los Angeles Times described best how I felt about this book after reading it, that it is genuinely instructive, elaborating a practical philosophy to help us slow down and temporarily sidestep the forces aligned against both our mental health and long-term human survival. And the reason she is here today, kicking off Birding to Beat the Winter Blues, our series on bird watching as a practice for our mental and physical well-being, is because she advocates for turning to the physical environment, to our bioregion, and specifically to watching and listening to birds as a way to refuse the attention economy. Jenny Odell is a Bay Area local and lives in Oakland, and I loved your descriptions of urban bird encounters interspersed throughout the book. There was a specific description of a night heron that made me laugh out loud twice. I reached out to Jenny on a whim based on the simple premise that it seemed like we were kindred spirits through our shared interest in birds. She is a multidisciplinary artist and writer. She has been an artist in residence at the San Francisco Planning Department, Recology SF, the New York Public Library, and the Internet Archive. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Paris Review. And last year, she reviewed bird songs for The Believer. For the last 6 years, she has taught art at Stanford University. So Jenny, thank you so much again for being here today. Is there anything you'd like to add to that introduction for our audience before we get started with a question?
I don't think so. I think you covered it all.
Great. Well, I'm going to stop sharing and launch into our Q&A. So I have some questions. I had a lot of questions after reading this book, but the first question I want to start out with is not necessarily related to the book. I was just wondering if you have a recent nature note or something you've observed recently that you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, I do actually, as of this morning. So I went for a walk because I'm actually looking at starting to rain now. I was trying to get a walk in before the rain. And I noticed a ton of pine siskins on this one block in my neighborhood that I've seen them on a couple times before, but I know that they're in the Bay Area in bigger numbers this year because I was reading about that. And I was so happy to see them because it seems like they really enjoy pecking at those kind of like spiky seed pods on sycamores. And I had seen them once before that crazy windstorm. And then after that, I noticed that all of those pods were on the ground. So I got worried that I wasn't going to see them anymore. And then today was walking down the same street. And I guess amazingly, there's some that are still on the trees. And so they're still there. And I was just like, it was like so unexpected. It was already unexpected the first time because it's not sort of a usual thing around here. But like specifically today, I was just like so happy to see them. And it's also pretty characteristic of my in my bird watching practice, which is like pretty informal. Like I was on my way somewhere else. I wasn't, necessarily, I didn't even have my binoculars with me. So I'm very fortunate to live in a neighborhood where that can happen pretty frequently.
That is hilarious. I saw a very similar thing in my neighborhood, but it was after the windstorm when all of those spiky little things had fallen to the ground. And I was on a neighborhood walk and saw probably 40 birds clustered around this one tree, just frenzied pecking at those spikes. And I've heard that too, that there has been increased numbers of pine siskins, and I've also heard that it is a good idea right now to be extra careful with cleaning out your bird bath and your bird feeder because of the numbers they are gathering in. Turns out they are also having an outbreak
pandemic.
Exactly, amongst themselves. So if you have a bird feeder, if you have a bird bath, maybe I'll send a resource in the follow-up email about how you can maintain those for the birds at this time. That is a good nature note and interesting. And they're huge flocks of birds. They're pretty.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I have a recording on my phone. It's about a minute long from the first time I saw them, just because it was so loud on the street. And I don't know, it's like, maybe especially right now, sometimes I get self-conscious about, being in front of like someone's house with my phone, like just because they might not know, right? Like it's very possible that, I mean, I think about myself, in like 2012, 2013, like before I really got into birds, and I, probably wasn't pine siskins, but there's tons of things that I was hearing without hearing. So it's like very easy for me to imagine someone not paying attention to these giant flocks of birds, and yet I'm standing there with my phone. But it's also like, to me, it's significant that this is like, 5 or so blocks from my apartment. It's not some kind of like rarefied thing. Like they just also live here for the moment.
Right. They are also residents in the neighborhood for this time being. And yes, I do want to clarify, there's a couple questions in the chat that the outbreak the pine siskins are experiencing is salmonella. I think maybe one person said that, and there was a resource shared there. So thank you all for chiming in there. And that takes us right into another question I had, which is about the title of this event. I want to talk a little bit about bird noticing, the term bird noticing. Can you talk about why you'd like to rename bird watching to bird noticing, and give our audience some context for the title of this event?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think about actually just the kind of associations with different terms, like, there's like birding versus bird watching. Already is sort of they have very different, one sounds kind of more serious than the other. And I honestly, I thought of the term bird noticing in 2016 when I was writing the talk that turned into the book, How to Do Nothing. Because I think maybe partially because I had owned binoculars and a bird guide for a long time. My dad gave them to me, and I just hadn't used them. And I'm sort of like dimly aware of birds. Like I knew what a scrub jay was. There was a few others maybe, but it was really that year that I was sitting in the rose garden. That's my background. Kind of long enough to just simply like notice something that had been there all along. And I also like that term because it was for me, it was so much, it was so auditory. So like learning to identify birds for me was so much about like the sounds, or following a sound. And like, really, I'm sure like many folks here know the experience of like, you hear something in a tree and you're just standing under the tree and you're trying to triangulate your vision and the sound. Right. And then even it gets really subtle, right? Like types of movement that you're seeing, or different songs that a bird might sing over different parts of the year. So it's like, I guess I like that term, like noticing, because it includes this weird idea that something could have been in front of you for your entire life, or you could have been hearing it for your entire life, but now it's like, you notice it.
Right. Now you notice it, and it may or may not be visual. It may be auditory. Yeah, I really liked that term as well, because I like to use notice as a term when I'm making observations of all kinds of different things in nature, just to start with that term, I notice. And I think it is a really inclusive term when it comes to being out and specifically trying to notice birds. I also find myself noticing birds more often by ear first before I hear them, whether that's like a shuffling on the ground or some branch cracking or something dropping, or, you know, a chirp or a call. So I think that I really appreciated that term when you used it in your book and really clearly latched on to it.
Yeah. And I should also say, like, I think I in terms of its inclusivity, like, you know, it includes different senses, but also I think maybe it's a little bit more accessible sounding. Um, you know, I think birding, like so many other things, is I don't even know how to describe it. It's a very specific area of interest, right? It has, you know, there are activities and tools and terms that are associated with it, which I really love. But I can also imagine someone who's not, you know, familiar with that, feeling a little bit intimidated or alienated by that. And I also think, you know, like someone who's waiting for the bus and is like looking at what pigeons are doing, like, to me, like that's absolutely a part of like what I'm talking about. So like maybe bird noticing makes it a little bit more generalized. At least I would hope. Yeah.
Right. I love that point. Yeah, that it can happen you can be noticing birds at any time. You don't have to go to a specific place with specific gear to do this specific thing. I've also had kind of a mixed reaction to using the word birding, even though I use it even in the title of this series. And I think that it's worth coming up with other terms and seeing how people relate to them. And this is the most captivating one that I have heard of thus far. But I really thank you for expanding on that point a little bit. I think it's a good one. And hopefully I see more people talking about bird noticing as I go on. And so I personally picked up your book after the onset of COVID, since I was spending more time at home and feeling my attention being pulled more drastically toward my phone and towards social media. I know a lot of other folks have experienced a similar thing in the last year. And so that is how I came to your book. And your book starts by exploring how you went to the Rose Garden in the place in your background in Oakland. And that was a frequent occurrence in 2016 as a kind of natural reaction to the current events. Can you talk a little bit about how the events of this past year have perhaps changed your relationship with the topics you explore in How to Do Nothing? Or maybe talk a little bit about, have you found yourself watching birds more this year or taking more time to do nothing, to go to places like the Rose Garden? Or conversely, have you noticed it being harder to engage in those kinds of activities in this past year?
Yeah, I would say that this honestly just feels like part two of the conditions that I wrote the original How to Do Nothing talk in. So many things are familiar, and it's like so many of the sort of questions that I had around how do I stay engaged without destroying myself. You know, like that was a question that I had in 2016, and it's like I'm having deja vu. So that kind of like ongoing negotiation that I do talk about in the book, right, which is like, you know, I use the term standing apart to talk about, you know, remaining engaged, but in a way that feels intentional and sustainable, and not just kind of constantly being yanked back and forth in a state of like frenzy. So I have, if anything, I think I've just found myself revisiting some of those ideas, and finding them to be useful in yet another context. But I think something that's been specific to this year has been, well, so I'm writing another book about time right now. So I'm already thinking about time. So time is obvious. And I started writing that book proposal before the pandemic started. So there's like no way I could have known how weird time was going to become. But, you know, there's, depending very much on your circumstances and, you know, what your work is, I think everyone's having an unusual experience of time right now. Like for some people, that means like it feels like you're living the same day over and over again. Some people feel like they have too much time. Some people have less time. Like, you know, but whatever it is, it's definitely not what people are used to, right? And so I have been thinking a lot about how much noticing things and novelty is associated with the sense of time passing. So if you feel that you've lived the same day over and over again, it feels like time hasn't passed. Like there's that joke about like, oh, you know, people were calling it like March 100th, like in the summer, that somehow time is not going forward. And so it's really, I think, become this game for me anyway, of like, how can I notice something new on the same walk that I have gone on like every day since March? I'm not going anywhere. I'm just in my neighborhood. And so like that's like sort of a new challenge or a more challenging version of what I was already kind of trying to advocate in the book, which is, you know, an attention to your locale. But it's like, this is like hyper attention to my hyper locale because I've, you know, it's like this very consistent experience. And one thing that's done is made me very aware of ecological time, which is what I'm trying to write about right now. So because a certain frame is held constant, right? Like I could draw you a map of a 5-mile radius from my apartment in my sleep. So within that's constant. I've been very aware of seasonal changes, bird migrations, even just things like, you know, that aren't really necessarily like native species, but like things in people's gardens. There was, I don't remember what month this was, but I discovered this giant, I think it's called like chicken of the woods mushroom that was growing on this tree stump. I cannot even describe to you how, like, it was so big. I was like, what is that? And like it just appeared. Like I was talking to my boyfriend and I was like, that wasn't there like very recently. Like that just grew. And so we've been very attentive to these like small or seemingly small changes. And one that I've been aware of, I think the weather's been super weird lately, right? It's like it got really warm. But I noticed that when that happened, our sort of neighborhood birds on this block were all like singing different songs than usual or than they had been. So it has rendered me even more sensitive to those kinds of things. And I just want to, I have this book on my desk. I want to plug this book. Well, this is the advanced copy, so it's not really what it's supposed to look like, but, and then my background's making it. What It's Like to Be a Bird by David Sibley. I reviewed this and the most recent Jennifer Ackerman book, The Bird Way, for The Atlantic. And they're both about bird behavior. And to me, like that's been the big new thing for me this time around, is like, when I was writing How to Do Nothing, it was like I was learning which birds are which. Like I was becoming familiar with the way they look and what their names are, what sounds they make. And then this year has really been like, okay, I know their names but I still don't really feel like I fully grasp them because I'm always learning about things that they do, like ways that they build their nests or, you know, how they act in different situations, what their relationships with each other are, like that. Just, you could go on and on. So I think I've just been more attentive to sort of time-based changes, and behavior is one of those.
Definitely. I remember you mentioned in your book that is kind of the next, or not the next step, but a way to take your noticing further beyond learning something's name. And I have been told this previously too by teachers and other naturalists in my life, that often your learning can stop when you learn something's name, that you can see it and then think, I know what it is. I know that's a scrub jay and I don't need to look at it more. But then you might miss that scrub jay burying an acorn or a peanut or whatever it is under a bush, and then maybe you're uncovering it later or leaving it there. And there is so much that can be seen with a little more time and observation. So I'm glad to hear that is the topic, or related to what you're writing about in your next book. And I can send folks a link to that book by David Sibley. And that is a wonderful book. I also, what you were thinking of, getting really familiar with your small environment, your neighborhood, maybe even just your house. If you have a yard, maybe your yard. It just reminded me of, I've seen so many people posting on social media about when their houseplant gets a new leaf. And every time I just think that is so funny, but also kind of wonderful that you're giving this thing so much loving attention that you're like, it has a new leaf. Yeah. And your description of seeing that chicken of the woods fungus kind of reminded me of that. Like, you knew it wasn't there before because you've been paying such close attention to this specific, place and really learning it really well. And so there's a lot that you can get out of that too. And you have lots of other stories about kind of the birds and the things that are the critters that are in your neighborhood. And I would love to talk about that. I just love your story about the crows in your neighborhood and that you are friends with particularly. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that with the audience for folks who haven't read the book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, as I said, I'd had these kind of tools in this book for a while. And I think for me, the Jennifer Ackerman book, The Genius of Birds, was like my bird noticing gateway drug in terms of like just thinking about bird intelligence. Of course, that's how we define intelligence. But one of the things that I learned in that book was about the fact that crows can recognize human faces, and sort of the research that I think it's the University of Washington, Seattle, right? John Marsloff, who does like all the crow research. Mm-hmm. So just kind of crows are one of those birds, right? Like that people think they're very familiar with, and then it turns out that there's this whole other dimension to them. And so I was reading that, and there are some crows on my street, and so I tried befriending them by leaving like a peanut on the balcony once in a while, and it took a really long time to get their attention, but it eventually seemed to work. And that was in early 2016. And as I mentioned in the book, there was I named the two that were coming by Crow and Crowson because one was clearly the child of the other one. I can no longer tell them apart, and there's basically a small family of crows that seems to live on our block, and they recognize me and my boyfriend, and will sometimes like fly like and land like near us, kind of like. So it's like actually a lot. I feel like that's like longer than I've been friends with some people, but they're very familiar at this point. And I in the book I sort of talk about that year, particularly after the election, kind of sitting and there's basically a telephone line or power line like right in front of my balcony. So just they're sitting there and I'm sitting there, and looking at them, looking at me, and knowing that I'm being seen just as I'm seeing them, and the way that changes my perception of so many things, right? Like myself as an animal, my dwelling, this like weird box that I live in that they see me in, the shape of the hill that I live on. I'm much more, ever since I got to know them, I've been way more attentive to like the few redwoods that are on this block, because they like to land in them. They like tall trees, right? They want to land and like look around. So I pay more attention to that. And it's just it did such an amazing job of almost like wrenching me out of a very shallow form of attention, that to me is both what drives and is exacerbated by social media, and the attention economy, where you can get so myopic so fast. I'm still amazed. I mean, I think we should like respect the scale of the problem, right? Like it's no joke. There are like very smart people who are working on these things in order to keep you engaged all the time. It's like not something to be trivialized. And so, in the midst of that, like, I found that this was like a very powerful way of stepping outside of that and inhabiting like a different scale of time, different scale of space. And that has still continued. And I also just think for me, it was really fascinating to think about individual birds, right? Like, instead of like, again, the names, right? Oh, that's a chickadee. That's a, well, what if it's the chickadee? What if it's like always the same chickadee that's like always in that spot, right? And that's something that I have noticed a lot actually during the pandemic is because I've been going on these walks, you realize that like birds also have neighborhoods, right? It's not like they're just, you look at a range map in a guide and it's like, okay, that's giving you some general sense of where you might see this species. But like the truth is that they have homes like we do and they can be found around those homes. So I've also learned a lot more about like, oh, that particular, there's one corner in my neighborhood that always has tons of goldfinches. They just really like this couple of trees, that's their spot. And then there might be another place that like always has a lot of wrens or something like that. So I've become much more familiar with their like sort of addresses.
Yes. I was just realizing really quick, for folks who haven't perhaps read the book, could you give like a general definition of what the attention economy is? Although I know we've alluded to it already several times.
Yeah. So the attention economy, depending on who you ask, will probably be defined differently. I would define it as it's an economy whose currency is attention. So it would be anything that is optimized or designed to hold as much attention as possible for as long as possible. So the easiest and oldest example of that, in my opinion, is advertising. As long as we've had ads, there's been an attention economy. The point of an advertisement is to get the attention and direct it towards like buying something, right? And then more recently, obviously, social media is another form of the attention economy. Like I said, these things are designed with the little red bubble thing that pops up, and the I have to recommend something called I'm actually about to delete my Facebook account. I've been like working on that the last couple of days, but there's a Chrome plugin called Facebook Newsfeed Eradicator, and it makes your newsfeed go away and it replaces it with an inspirational quote. And if you get rid of the newsfeed, you will very quickly notice that is the most addictive and also most effective part of Facebook. So that's an example of the attention economy, right? It's like the design of something like the newsfeed, auto-playing videos, gamifying social interactions so that you want to get a higher number of retweets, likes. So that kind of attention as currency is like how I would define the attention economy. And I would also put personal branding in that bucket as well.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I just realized we should probably clear that up for some folks out there. And that is helpful. It grounds us a little bit in what we're talking about, which is sort of refusing the attention economy. I mean, these you talk about bird watching as, an alternative and a way to redirect your attention and put it into your bioregion, your environment around you. And that is just one way to do that. But you use the term refusal in place in the book, which I think connects directly to a concept. I mean, and perhaps a concept you're expanding more on in your book, but it's this concept of a sense of place. And I describe a sense of place as an awareness of and connection to the world around you. And that could be a lot of things: the air you breathe, the closest creek, the sounds in your neighborhood, perhaps knowing where the sun rose and where it sets. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you describe refusal in place in the book and how you came to arrive at that concept and way of relating or changing your relationship to the attention economy.
Yeah, I think probably the best example of what I mean by that is something that I talk about in that chapter, which is Bartleby the Scrivener, which is the Melville short story about the clerk who, when he's given some work, his boss tries to give him some work and he keeps saying, "I would prefer not to." And it's told from the point of view of his boss, who is just absolutely flabbergasted every time this happens, because he's like he's just, everything's going in the office, right? And then he tries to give this work to Bartleby and he says, I would prefer not to. And the reason that phrase is so inspirational to me, and this has been, a lot has been written about that phrase in that story, is that it's not yes and it's not no. It's I would prefer not to, which it's really, the more you think about it, the more profound it gets, because it's like, it's not even refusing to do the thing, it's refusing the terms of the question altogether, which when the boss asked it was not on the table. So like when he asked the question, the answers that were offered were yes and no. And Bartleby says, I would prefer not to, which is like, he creates this whole space around that question that he can inhabit. And of course, there's like many different readings of that story. Like some people see it as a very nihilist story because, you know, he dies in jail after continuing to say, I would prefer not to. But that's actually something that phrase I've been thinking about a lot in terms of engagement with social media and also news via social media. So not news altogether, but that particular form. And I think that it takes an enormous amount of mental discipline, and I don't think it's easy. And for me, it's like a lifelong effort to not fall into yes or no. Because I mean, if you think about it this way, like if someone ran up to you on the street and asked you a question with great urgency, it's like they are not giving you the time, and you are not giving yourself the time to even ask, like, should you even be asking me this question? Or do I want to answer this question? Or do I accept the answers that you're offering with this question? Like, what if I think there's a different question that I should answer, right? And so it's this like constant zooming out over and over again, like looking around, trying to find more context. And that's a big part of why the book, kind of the movement that the book traces, is like, here is a way to do that zooming out, kind of like step back from the attention economy. And then as you do that and you kind of look around, like my suggestion is that bioregionalism is one of the things that you might naturally begin to notice. And then it just so happens that ecology is full of helpful metaphors involving, you know, patience, context, like complexity, the ability to sit with complexity, interdependence, different ways of thinking about the individual that aren't so individualistic. So that, I think, yeah, for me, refusal in places is kind of like, it's not yes and it's not no. It's some kind of awareness of that whole axis of yes and no that lets you maybe conceptually stand a little bit to the side of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it is a reasonable thing to assume that by refusing in place, you would start to notice, your awareness would start to expand. I think that it begs your attention in a lot of ways. And that is true whether you have easy access to somewhere with a lot of trees or with more open space, or whether you are in, you know, downtown Oakland or San Francisco. I think that is something that we kind of instinctually turn to, is observing what else is around us. And the goal with this series, and the goal our goal in general, my goal as an educator, as an environmental educator, is to encourage folks to lean into giving your attention to the natural world in whatever way that it happens for you, whether it is crows that come, you know, to your balcony, which is, I also have some really interesting stories about crows in my neighborhood. That's kind of what gets my attention too here in Santa Rosa. Or, you know, you're out on a hike and looking at a lot of other things. So I think it is a powerful force for good for our mental health in general. I have to say that there's hilarious thing with crows in my neighborhood that I really wanted to mention, because I thought you would appreciate it, and also because our audience might appreciate it. But I ever since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been going out early in the morning and exercising or doing something outside. And that has meant that I've always been, not always, but pretty regularly outside around 8 o'clock in the morning. And I see this man who bikes down my street, and he wears all neon clothes, and he has like a tall like hat and long, flowing like gray hair and beard, and he bikes very upright, and he has like this little also neon lunchbox on the back of his bike. And every morning, this is real, it's amazing. It's probably like once a week, but it's very regular. I see this guy bike by our house and reach back into that lunchbox and throw out a handful of Cheetos for crows that are waiting for him. It's amazing. If anyone knows who this man is, at first I was really enraged by this because there's just this huge flock of crows and it's Cheetos and just the whole thing. I was just enraged in general with the state of the world, and this man kind of got some of the brunt of that. And for a long time, I was like, I am going to say something. And finally, after months of this, there was a perfect moment where I could talk to him, and I like mustered up my courage. And I was like, when he was reaching back to toss the Cheetos out, I was like, please don't throw your Cheetos here. That was like what I had the courage to get out. And he was totally stunned, naturally, and just looked at me and kind of scoffed and biked away, which I later felt, after some reflection, I think that was a good reaction, because I kind of felt like I upset the balance of things, because when he biked away after not throwing out his Cheetos, all the crows took off and followed him down the road. Oh, no. It was this amazing image of him in his neon gear biking down the road, all like probably 10 crows following him. Anyway, I felt like he's now just a part of the ecosystem here. And so that has been a kind of a joyous thing for me to watch here. So yes, Santa Rosa. Yes, someone is saying I might have seen him. I live near Spring Lake. So yes, it might be the same man who, yes, has a special relationship with the crows. And that has been a really fun pandemic observation for me. So I really wanted to bring that in, since you also have a neighborhood crow experience. I did want to ask you, because I think this may be particularly relevant to this crowd we have here at the Laguna Foundation. You talk a little bit about using iNaturalist in How to Do Nothing. iNaturalist is an app that helps identify flora and fauna and around the world. It's amazing. And you use it in your book to learn a little bit more about the bioregion where you live. This is an audience that I imagine has some iNaturalist users in it. And of course, you also mentioned that while talking about using iNaturalist, writing about using iNaturalist, you've been asked, does iNaturalist not alienate you from the landscape? It is an app. So where does using iNaturalist fit in, and how have you kind of answered that question when it's been posed to you?
Yeah, so I think that I actually often use iNaturalist as an example of the fact that when you see someone, out on a hike and they have their phone, you don't know what they're doing with it. So, I really try to push against the sort of, kids these days are looking at their phone too much, like blanket statement, like way of looking at things. I mean, I think that a phone and a computer and these things are just tools. And unfortunately, things like social media are specifically designed to be addictive. But, in terms of like what technology means, like I consider my glasses to be technology, binoculars are technology. So for me, like it just exists in that spectrum. And I use iNaturalist. I used it a lot when I was starting to just getting started learning about my bioregion that I grew up in, because I'm from the Bay Area. And then over time, I've used it less here because I've learned. I've used it. It was a learning tool. And And so if I'm hiking here, like I'm not necessarily using it very often because, similar to birds, right? Like I'm getting some familiarity. But I use it a lot if I go somewhere new, because that for me, that's a way of just kind of getting to know, just like meeting a person, right? It's like you have to ask really basic questions when you meet someone for the first time. And I also really enjoy the community aspect of that app. So the fact that, it's using machine learning to give you some good guesses with your photo, but then it's usually confirmed, or something else is suggested by a person. And I once went to an iNaturalist happy hour in the East Bay. And I met some of the people who had confirmed or corrected some of my observations. And it was really lovely just to know that we're all kind of paying attention to the same things. I've also noticed that there's certain people seem to favor certain types of observations. So like if I have some kind of like mushroom thing, like it'll always be like the same person. So I'm like, that person is just sitting there waiting for mushroom observations. But yeah, in a weird way, iNaturalist is kind of a social media in terms of like you do have a profile and it shows what your observations are. So yeah, I guess I would just say like I see it as one tool among many, and it's also one moment in a process of learning. For me, it's the beginning moment, and then from that point on, I'll probably read some more about it or just notice it more over a period of time. Things like behavior, like those things that come after. And so I really don't see it as sort of like a replacement or anything that's kind of, I see it as like a point of entry, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good way to look at it. It's one tool among many to use to explore the natural world around you. And it may be one that works better for you than others, or not. And so it's just another tool to have in your back pocket. And I would say that there is a nice community aspect to it that I have found as well. And it is community based around such a specific thing, based around the natural world, which, as you've mentioned, as you just talked about, can be really helpful and, support you in your learning. And yet it is yet another app or something to have a specific relationship to. So it is an interesting balance I have found. And yeah, I would say it's worth trying out. It certainly helped me with my learning too. But I am glad you brought it up in your book, because I was kind of wondering about that specifically, or those types of tools. It also goes for other app-based things that you can use for learning about nature, like eBird even as well. So I think that it relates, and I'm glad that you talked about it. One last question for you before perhaps we take like a question or two from the audience. If you all out there have questions for either of us, for Jenny, go ahead and think about them. You can drop them in the chat and I will try to keep track. We should have time for a couple. Do you want to talk a little bit more before we do that about your new book? About, you've alluded to it already, about talking about ecological time. Can you expand on that, or give us whatever update you have?
Yeah. So if I didn't have a virtual background, you would see a wall that was entirely covered in ugly Post-its and cut out pieces of paper. So I'm on chapter 3 right now. And the book, in a lot of ways, is very similar to How to Do Nothing, in that it's partly about something ecological, and then it's partly not, and it's kind of trying to stitch those things together. In this case, I've been thinking a lot about the history of how time came to be seen as money. It's just kind of like that's in a way implicit in How to Do Nothing. So that's an ongoing concern of mine. And then also a sort of annoyance that I was experiencing with the discourse of time management, commercial time management, as like self-help, because I feel like there are two groups of people. Well, it's probably more than two, but there's two groups of people potential audiences. And like one is someone like me who is very privileged and has a high degree of temporal autonomy and is too busy, like actually too busy. It's been better lately, but in ways that I am bringing upon myself because of ideas of perfectionism or cultural conditioning, things like this. That's one group. Then you have another group that just actually honestly has no time for reasons that are beyond their control. And like to conflate those two to me is just really annoying. And so I see that a lot in time management, where it's like part of this bootstrapper mentality of like, it's a little bit like when people say like, oh, just don't buy so many lattes, like as financial advice. It's like, I think the problems are deeper than that. It's like, maybe it's student debt. So yeah, there's that kind of time is money side of things. And then, I'm not, it's early on in the process for me, so I'm not sure how all these things will gel, but I know that is a piece. Ecological and geological time is a piece of it. And then climate dread is a piece of it. And just kind of in a way, like it's coming from a process of personal questioning, much like How to Do Nothing did, where I am simply just trying to find and place myself in time in a coherent way, which is very hard right now, I think. And so I'm hoping to, again, similar to How to Do Nothing, bring the reader along with me on this quite earnest line of questioning.
Yeah, I appreciate that tone that you took with How to Do Nothing, where it was the questioning and kind of a journey, where you can draw your own answers from a lot of the things you pull together, or just take from it what you will. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say about time. And yes, especially now when it is really, it is a strange time. I've said that, couldn't tell you. Probably at least every day. So I think I would look forward to reflecting on this time period and while reading that book and seeing what I can glean from it for myself. And I hope that maybe I would think others would do the same. Others who maybe enjoyed your first book. And yeah, I think you do such a good job of pulling together these really big concepts and making, bringing them down to these very specific examples that are interesting. I mean, there's so much in your book that I wanted to, research, or there's other books that I wanted to read that you mentioned. So there's just so much information in your first book, and I'm sure the second one would be similar. So thank you for sharing a little bit about that, for giving us a teaser, and good luck working on it. I guess I'd love to hear from, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Looks like we've got one that's for you that says, now that you've really tuned into birds, have birds become part of an attention economy for you? Is this bird behavior designed to be addictive, or vice versa?
That is a great question, because I have often referred to myself as an involuntary bird watcher, which it is addictive. And it's also like, I'm thinking of like the other day I was sitting in this park near my apartment, and I was looking at something on my phone that I like did not need to be looking at, but it was like absorbing, and it's kind of like stuck there. And then I think it was a kinglet or some very small bird that, I see around. It just landed like right next to me because this bench happens to be next to this bush. And I was just, when that happens, you're like, you just have to drop everything. Like, because, the thing about birds that's different from other animals, in my opinion, is like, they show up out of nowhere and then they just disappear because they fly. So it's like, when you see one, you already don't know, like the clock is already running down. Like you don't know how long it's going to be there. So, and especially if it's an unfamiliar bird, then for me, I am like, oh, gotta memorize like all the details and like really pay attention. And it just, you kind of like snap to attention in a way, at least I do. And that is not a conscious decision. That just happens. And so I, as a person who gets easily absorbed in things, I've thought a lot about how, especially right now during the pandemic, when someone who maybe is anxious and prone to doom scrolling and things like this, that it may just be a question of finding things that are more absorbing than that, that are fulfilling instead of draining, and keeping those things kind of like close at hand.
That sounds like a great way to go about it. Something more absorbing. I think that has worked better for me than trying to just fully opt out of some of these things, which that kind of leads into another question from the audience. Someone says, you mentioned that you're in the process of deleting Facebook. Has anything made you feel like opting out is better for you than trying to engage with it differently? So it kind of ties into what you just mentioned, but
so I guess I should have contextualized that by saying that my Facebook account has been essentially dormant for a very long time. Basically, ever since I added that Facebook newsfeed eradicator, I stopped using it, because that's the thing, right? When you log in, just kind of grabs you. It's like, here's like someone saying something that is supposedly relevant to you. You don't get you don't get to have the I would prefer not to moment. It's just already there. So once that was gone, I found that like I had no reason to log in anymore. And that took a while, but over time, I think I have I have Twitter, and I have an Instagram account, which is basically Facebook, right? It's owned by Facebook. So my decision to delete Facebook is really just kind of like I wasn't using it anyway, and so I might as well get rid of it. But one thing that I do really recommend to anyone here who has a Facebook account, and you don't this is something that I did in preparation for deleting it, but this is just something you can do, is you can go to Facebook, and there's under settings, you can download your data. And I did that, and it downloads a zipped folder of HTML, basically. And it has all of the data that they have on you. And like, again, we all know this, right? Like, we all know Facebook, the amount of data that they have, and it's very creepy. Okay, I know that. But it's very different to sit there and click through, like, here is all of your activity on outside websites. Here's all the times that you engaged with these advertisements. Like, here's the demographic of your friends. Like, here are all of your messages. Like, right? It's like, it's very different to sit there and actually just look at it. And it's honestly quite disgusting. So, but it's a good disgust to have. I think it's very instructive. So I highly recommend that.
Right. It might push you to opting out if you were to see that just written so explicitly, really everything that they have. Wow. I'm fascinated. I might have to try. At least I would. Yeah, I love the idea of that newsfeed add-on. So I want to look into that. There are a couple quick questions before we end here. Do you have any recommendations for resources for learning more about bioregionalism specifically?
Yeah, I guess I think it depends on like what kind of category. So, there's like plants versus animals. There's also like geological. I'm going on a whole geology kick right now. So I think, if it's, and well, I say that, but anything you pick will become an entryway into other things. So maybe that's a better thing to say. Like, maybe you just start with birds, like Sibley. I have the Sibley West, Sibley Birds West, but pretty much like any bird guide for the Bay Area. And just, even if it's very slow going, just kind of like starting to notice those birds. And the reason I say that that's an entry point is because, as I mentioned in the book, you can only get so far without it becoming about other things. So, this species of bird is found in this type of habitat. So then you have to start paying attention to that habitat. Then you're like, okay, what is that habitat made out of? Then you learn about the trees. There's a book, can't remember the name of it now, about Western forests that I relied on early on. Yeah, the name is escaping me, but yeah, like a guide, a tree guide would be good too. Sorry that I can't think of the specific one, but we're also very lucky, I think, in the Bay Area. A lot of IRL bookstores have really, really great ecology sections. So I would say like the gold standard is the Point Reyes bookstore, but
Yeah.
I live near Walden Pond, so they have a really great section as well. And almost everything that I have bought in that category, and also many of the things that I reference in the book, I got from the ecology section there. So, just relying on something like, a store or even a librarian or just someone who would have, get you oriented, and so that you're not just feeling like you're going and getting random things. But I would just say like pick some sort of point of entry, and then if as you follow that, other things will sort of naturally suggest themselves.
Right. Something you either really want to learn about or something you already know you're curious about, something that draws your eye. And yes, they just open doors to each other. I have found that too. And that perhaps explains why you're on a geology kick at the moment, because all roads lead to geology, arguably. So that makes a lot of sense. Yes, lots of love for Point Reyes bookstore. It's a wonderful place. There is a simple question in the chat that sounds simple. I mean, maybe it's not a simple question, but what is your favorite bird? Do you have a favorite?
That is one of those simple but not simple questions. So it's like I have different favorites for different reasons. Like, and then I'm sure, like we all do this thing of, oh, there's a kinglet just landed outside my window. And I have different favorites at different times also of the year. But I guess I would say, if I had to pick one, it would probably be a Western tanager, which I actually have, which it's on the cover of the Sibley book that I mentioned. But I also have this hat.
Yes.
And sometimes I wear this just so that when people see me like staring at something and then they see the hat, they're like, oh, okay, I know what she's doing. It's less creepy. But yeah, Western tanagers, just because they're so unusual. I mean, they have the red head and the yellow body and the contrast. And I also don't see them very often. And they're migratory, so I will only see them at specific times. But I know many folks here are probably familiar with this feeling. I saw one once around the corner from my apartment, and it was so unexpected. Like I was like at the grocery store or something, and I was just like going home, and I saw it, and I just was staring at it until it left. And I don't know if there's like a word for this, but like I always look at that tree now. I can't not look at that tree. I look at it out on the wrong season. I looked at it today, like just, like it's always going to be that tree where I saw that bird. And so it's like a very permanent marker. Whereas like before, I probably never even noticed that tree. So.
Yeah, there should be a word for that. Always waiting or something, like, some miracle could happen there again at some point. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We have just 4 minutes left. There are still questions in here and some good ones, like, do you believe that birds are watching us more intently than vice versa? I don't know if we have time to go into that, because I did want to say just really thank you for being here, and thank you to the audience, all of you, for supporting us, for supporting our work, for taking the time to be here with us today as this atmospheric river comes in. I hope that you all stay safe out there. And I hope you enjoyed this kickoff to our series on bird noticing, and learned a little bit about how powerful your attention really is, and the way that bird watching can perhaps fit into your self-care, your care for your mental health, especially during these times. And now to look forward to a new book coming from Jenny about time and other and about ecological time, and how you can use, well, what am I trying to say here? You can look forward to more of your work, which is delightful and so interesting and so useful to us, especially now more than ever, as we keep saying nowadays. And yes, just huge thank you to you. I hope to see you all who are out there at one of the other events in the series. I will be sure to send links in that follow-up email if you'd like to register, if something struck your interest. And I did want to say, lastly, there was a request for an update on the bald eagles at the Laguna de Santa Rosa from some of our local folks in the audience. I don't have an update. So the Laguna used to have bald eagles. Then we didn't have bald eagles for a long time. And they recently reappeared, I think, in the last decade-ish. And they have a nesting site at one part of the Laguna, kind of close to our office. And I saw bald eagles one of the last times I was at the office, which was a while ago because I've been working from home this whole time. The bald eagle was circling with a bunch of turkey vultures kind of on a thermal. It was so much bigger than the turkey vultures. It was kind of amazing to get to see them next to each other. And so I believe that there are bald eagles still in the Laguna. I don't have an update on nesting because I haven't been out there as much as I usually am. So stay tuned. Hopefully some of our bird watching friends gives us an update here soon. There has been a bald eagle seen at Spring Lake in Santa Rosa recently, which is new. Folks have been reporting that for the last week or so. So if you want to try and get a sighting there, might have good luck. So, all right. Well, thank you all so much. And I hope to see you again. Jenny, thank you. It was lovely to meet you.
Likewise.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Take care. And
right,
thanks
everyone
for being here. Bye.
Bye.